Thank you to all the speakers for their talks. My question is, in recent years and in the years to come, we're going to see a massive increase in big data and open data. And I was just wondering, how do you think this will impact statistical literacy, if that can be a term to be used, in the public? Thank you.
From what I've seen of big data, I don't think it necessarily changes the type of stories that you write. It's a different way of doing it, but you still need to interpret that and give it the same kind of context that you would to any other story. I mean, it is a challenge for journalists to get better at that, but I think for the general public, they are not going to be trawling through these massive databases. They're going to rely on people to do it for them.
So I sort of think big data isn't really a thing. I mean, it's just still data, really. You know, the rules are only slightly changing. But I think one thing that is making a big difference is that people are becoming a lot more concerned about their own privacy when it comes to the data that's being recorded. And in a sense then are motivated to find out a lot more about, you know, what's being done with their data, how it's being processed, anonymised and so on. And I think there's an opportunity there that's created by virtue of the fact that people are becoming concerned about it to sort of open out the conversation a little bit better and improve statistical literacy as a result.
I mean, I think I'd agree with the others that big data as such is not going to change this debate. Might change other things, but not this. Open data, I think, might be another matter, and it's a question of who analyses the data that are now available, who works with them, who produces stories based on them, and whether data journalists do that to a much greater extent than they've currently been able to do. I think it's a bit too early to say whether that will actually happen. The possibility is there. I don't think it will be the case that general members of the public will be poking in these databases the whole time, but it might be the case that people who know about dealing with data and work in the media do it to a greater extent than they do now.
I think the problem with big data and data science in general, which is a wonderful development, but it does mean that I think more and more of people's, as quotes, discoveries and findings will be based on routine data, non-experimental data, and therefore full up with all the flaws we know about and which we're used to recognising in the sort of studies we've been talking about. But actually critiquing somebody has learnt from social media or has learnt from something else. These are skills that standard statisticians don't really have, apart from having a basic scepticism about it.
And I think the issue with statistical literacy and big data is that this is my view and not the BBC's, news organisations should not be allowed to invest in a big data strategy or claim to have a big data strategy until more than a certain proportion of their newsroom can reliably work out a percentage.
Question from the front.
Oliver Gillies, scientist and health journalist, formerly at the Sunday Times and the Independent. My issue is with the first speaker who said that epidemiologists shouldn't give advice. In my view, everybody should be giving whatever advice they can based on their knowledge and their experience, and I certainly want to know what the epidemiologist's advice would be, even if it's a bit bonkers. As a health journalist, I've given a great deal of advice on all sorts of things, and I've drawn it from wherever I possibly can, and I think epidemiologists are capable of they're likely to be thinking about why they're doing what they're doing and coming up with some interesting ideas. So I just want to say I don't think we can depend on doctors for advice because they often don't know about the science. So who are we going to get our advice from if we don't get it from the journalists and the epidemiologists?
I would be very happy for epidemiologists to make their comments as part of an interview, even as part of a press release. It's when it's part of the paper that I think it's completely inappropriate. It's not their professional skills, it's not part of the scientific study for them to give their personal opinions at the end of a supposedly scientific paper that's been published in a scientific journal, and that's what tends to happen. So I think that's completely inappropriate. There are people with those skills, people like NICE, people who do public health modelling, who work out the full impact of a piece of advice, taking into account the totality of the effects, not just a single unidimensional aspect that epidemiologists will generally be interested in.
So a question from Janine Ford. How can we make or encourage more academics to want to communicate to non-academics?
Good question.
I think it, if I may jump in, I think that depends on which academics it is. I mean, in my experience, there's no shortage of academics wanting to communicate to non-academics. Perhaps fewer actually amongst the statistical community than other areas in science and health that I sort of have things to do with. Many academics seem to be terribly keen to do this, and I think the problems arise because some of them just aren't very good at it. I mean, if I may be permitted an anecdote, I do write comments for the Science Media Centre sometimes, and the strangest things that happened to me on that, I will give no details so as not to identify the innocent. I wrote one of these things about a paper in which the press release made an outrageous and clearly silly claim that went beyond what the study could possibly have done. But actually, the title of the paper essentially made the same claim. And I wrote something saying, look, you know, it's a good study in the following respects, but it absolutely doesn't establish this thing that it says it establishes. And within 10 minutes, this was before any of this was published, the Science Media Centre informed the authors about this stuff, informed the press officers, and the press office in this person's particular university informed the author, who was straight on the phone to me and complained that I was criticising the paper. And I said, but you gave it this title, which is clearly wrong. And this person said, but we need to get this before the public and before the things. And anybody who knows about this will understand that that claim can't possibly be true. And I ended up saying, you know, it's a rhetorical device. I ended up saying, wait till you see what the Daily Mail says. The Daily Mail took it at face value. And I think that's the problem. This scientist, and there are plenty of others out there, want to communicate, but they get something strange across.
I think this is terribly important, but it's got to be done carefully. As you know, you get the wrong words, as the ghastly statements by Tim Hunt showed so clearly. When an academic goes wild, it's an absolute disaster. So I think this is absolutely right, but you need training. You know, I've been doing a bit of this, and I'm still struggling away. And so within the RSS, we've got this system now of RSS ambassadors. We're trying to train up, you know, young statisticians to act as communicators. I think this is vital within all scientific disciplines, but particularly statistics. Statisticians have been too quiet for too long, but you can't just get up and spout. You know, you do need training, but there's now opportunities. As Kevin was saying, there's a huge interest in the sort of stuff that statisticians do, from the newspapers, from obviously more or less, but other things. I get bombarded with requests, and so I think there's a tremendous opportunity for statisticians to take a higher profile, but you've got to go at it carefully. I think you know, we all make mistakes.
I agree with that. I think I'd also add, well, so I certainly agree with the fact that, you know, not everybody's good at this, and maybe not everybody should do it. But I also think that it would be good if the academic reward structure recognised this a lot more. And I think that that's sort of what people were trying to do with the impact statements on the ref, and that comes with its own inevitable flaws. But I think, recognising this type of engagement, because I think it is just incredibly important that these kind of conversations happen. Recognising within the academic community.
I think, aside from the very occasional statistician I speak to who's terrified of journalists, I think it's very unusual to find someone who's done research and doesn't want to talk about it, who's been, you know, sat in a room coming up with this paper for however many months it is, and you say, I'd like you to explain it so I can give it some wider coverage, and they say, no, I'm not interested. I think that happens very rarely.
Yeah, and I think that's true, but in terms of how you communicate, I think what we want, and training might be helpful, but sometimes can get in the way of this, is just people speaking naturally, how they might do, you know, explaining it when they got home over dinner or something. So, you know, we want people we don't want people talking about serious methodological flaws in a paper. We want to say, this is a great big steaming pile of nonsense, you know. Speak like you might do after 2 glasses of wine is always a good, advice for, it's what we want.
Question from the front here.
Hi, so I'm Bilal Nassim. I'm a researcher at the Institute of Education. I guess broadly we've been talking about barriers to effective communication between journalists and academics, and broadly it's been speaking about statistics and kind of numeracy, but in my experience it's largely been about language, terminologies, the way things are described, the words that are used to characterize relationships or variables or so on. And I guess I'm always interested in, to what extent, I guess it's a twofold question, to what extent are there pressures on the reporting side for things to be characterized in a certain way, whether it be political or just a cultural zeitgeist of the time? And to what extent would you encourage academics to not be quite, as my natural inclination is to be a bit intransigent about it, to just relax a little bit, let there be a certain amount of rope that's given to that?
We'll have one from hashtag, and then we'll put both to the panel.
Yep, sure. So there's a question at the top here saying, really entertaining lectures. Please share more examples of best practice directed at David.
And that's a comment, so another from the floor.
Alison McFarlane from City University London. I'd just like to go back to David's comment about don't get epidemiologists to advise on public health, but as statisticians, often we are presenting the statistics of somebody else's area of expertise. So I might be explaining to a journalist about some statistics about midwifery or obstetrics, and they then ask you what your opinion clinically, because that saves them trying to find someone else to give that question. And where do you draw the line? I always say, well, now you need to find an obstetrician or a midwife to answer that question. And so that's not about being frightened of journalists, that's having the confidence to draw the line. How do you draw the line?
Okay. Panel on either of those?
Well, on that last one, when the journalist is asking you whether the stats show that your minister is a fool, you put them over to your press office. You're not compelled to talk to journalists. It's better if you do, because otherwise they talk to the press office talks to you, you talk to the press office talks to us, and I've got to be on air in 10 minutes. But if it gets to the point where you're not comfortable with the question, then send them off to the press office.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
That's all right if there is a press office. I mean, sometimes you end up in conversations like this. And
off to another professional.
Yeah. But I mean, I have found myself occasionally in the awkward position where they have not got time to talk to anybody else because the thing needs to go to air or whatever. And when do I stop? And so I probably sometimes got it wrong. I mean, I would aim to do what you've described, but it doesn't always work.
I always ask what their deadline is before I start answering the question.
Just on the language thing, I think I've tended to be too precious about it. And it's a good challenge. I did this climate change by numbers program for the BBC, where I was drawing on something and told I couldn't use the word distribution. Oh God! But I managed it, I think, in the end. So I think one can be a bit too precious, and one should be a bit more relaxed. When I found that if you have thought about it, made a bit of effort, that's fine.
Yeah, and I mean, just quickly on that, I think the other issue is that there are ways that we use language, even when we're trying to be informal, that are not understood necessarily by anyone else. I mean, a classic example of this in talking about correlation, where we mean or don't mean some sort of causal thing. So we use one set of words and we mean it's causal, we use another set of words and we mean it isn't causal. And we kind of understand that up to a point. I'm not saying we always get it right. But why would a journalist or any other rational human being understand it? It's a particular use of language which doesn't apply elsewhere. And that's awkward because we have to be careful about that, but we have no means of being reliably careful and communicating.
Just on good practice, I think there is some good practice. Actually, it's unfortunately too rare, but when randomised trials are reported, they tend to be done extremely well, I think.
And I think when you have a paper that you expect to be newsworthy, a very good tip is to practice how you are going to put over the key points succinctly, and perhaps colourfully, as Chris has indicated. Not to be too precious, but we need to practice it.
I always imagine explaining it to my mum, probably after 2 glasses of wine.
Yeah. Yes. 2 last questions from the floor, then I must let the audience go.
I'm a foreigner here, I'm a paediatrician, not a statistician, and my background is I'm interested in immunisation, which of course always gets a good balanced press. I think how one talks to the press is very reasonable, but how it is then handled, because it's only part of a story what one puts across. And I think it's all very well to say in the article you put a lot of caveats, but as a reader you see a big headline, you also see a picture of a child, quotes, damaged by a vaccine, and then you have perhaps a very good article written by hopefully a specialist journalist which does put the caveats in. But many people read the headline, look at the picture, the first few lines of the article, not the caveats. Rather like they read an insurance policy, missing out the little bit at the end that says you're not covered by this policy. How can you, as a specialist writing good news, persuade the person who writes the headline to fit with what you're saying? And I know it's difficult because you've got to have a short headline that's going to attract people.
We'll make that the last question, because it was a rather longer one. Gentlemen.
Well, we do have this discussion, but writing headlines is very difficult because you've got to summarise something in 5 words, which is inherently going to be quite complicated. So we hope that it's not misleading, but sometimes, you know, it's never going to give you the full story. And we say, well, we hope that the headline is going to be interesting enough that it's going to encourage you to read the first sentence, and that's going to be interesting enough that it's going to encourage you to keep reading, and so on and so on. Now, you're right that some people won't read all of that, and I think all we can do is try and make the writings interesting enough to ensure that they do, because we are dealing with people who could be, you know, watching Game of Thrones or Cats on YouTube, and we do have to deal with the attention spans people have just by trying to engage with them and make it as interesting as possible.
I think the power of, when I do stats training for journalists, the power of numbers in a headline is staggering, and it's very, very tempting to use them because the BBC website headlines are even more restrictive than the Times ones. We used to have to write our headlines between 31 and 33 characters. And while there are people in the BBC who are so brainwashed that if you ask them, they will, like that, give you a phrase in 31 to 33 characters, most of us aren't that damaged, and it's very hard to do. So, yeah, the temptation to use and indeed incorrectly use numbers in the headline is huge, and, you know, we try to battle it, but clearly there is, as you say, it's not easy.
Okay, I hope you agree we've had a fascinating set of talks over the last couple of hours, so can you please finish by showing your appreciation for David Spiegelhalter, Kevin Conway, Anthony Rubin,